from our headquarters in Kyiv, this is The Sunday Show on Hromadske International, the only prime-time TV program explaining the Eastern European geopolitical storm in English, and I am Natalia Humenyuk. Here is what we have prepared for you today. World leaders and top experts converge on Ukraine for the Yalta European Strategy Conference held in Kyiv. What they had to say about the UN peacekeepers in the Donbas, fighting corruption, and the future of Ukrainian economy. Moscow and Minsk carry out extensive military exercises on Belarusian territory. Why the country's Eastern European neighbors are worried. A children's book depicting an LGBT family sparks controversy in Ukraine. Why the right-wing backlash may have made Maya and her mothers the hit of the season, and how the society supports the writer.
Good evening. From our headquarters in Kyiv, this is the Sunday Show on Hromadske International, the only prime-time TV program explaining the Eastern European geopolitical storm in English. And I am Andrei Kulakov. Tonight on the Sunday Show, Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko meets with his Turkish counterpart, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Treason or just a day's work? Why Ukraine's security services accuse these media workers of supporting Russia? US Congressman Will Hurd talks military aid to Ukraine and Russian cyber warfare. A Belarusian LGBT activist is denied political asylum in Ukraine. We'll look at why. And there was no sex in the Soviet Union, or was there? A US filmmaker tells us about investigating the USSR's biggest taboo. Go to our webpage and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Search Hromadske International. We will be back in a second. On the 9th of October, Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko met in Kyiv with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. The Turkish leader visited Ukraine for the 6th meeting of the high-level strategic council between the two countries. Here's how Poroshenko met his Turkish counterpart. Erdogan maintains close ties with both Ukraine and Russia, as well as Eastern Europe. His country ostensibly supports the cause of Ukraine's Crimean Tatars, but opposes sanctions on the Kremlin for annexing the Crimean Peninsula. Let's take a look at what both leaders said about Crimea earlier this week.
At previous press conferences, I highlighted how delicate the Crimea annexation question is for Turkey. We're trying to take all possible measures to help our brothers, the Crimean Tatars, who are currently imprisoned. I think time will show the result of our efforts.
I invited Turkey to join our circle of friends for the deoccupation of Crimea, the initiative I announced from the United Nations rostrum in New York. We are very grateful and appreciative for Turkey's strong stance in the support of Ukrainian sovereignty, territorial integrity, and its independence, including Turkey's refusal to recognize the illegal annexation of Crimea. So where do Turkish-Ukrainian ties stand and where are they going? We're joined by former Ukrainian ambassador to Turkey, Sergiy Korsunsky. Good evening, Mr. Korsunsky.
Good evening.
Or should I say Ambassador Korsunsky?
It's your choice.
All right. Ambassador Korsunsky, how would you characterize the President Poroshenko's meeting this week with President Erdogan? What were the big takeaways?
First of all, we should understand that Turkey is one of the major regional powers which is around the Black Sea, and its position is extremely important from every point of Ukrainian foreign policy, I mean economically and politically. And definitely number one priority right now, that's the occupation of Crimea. So we have to work with Turkey. Doesn't matter how Turkey cooperate with Russia. So the meeting was very important. It has been happening maybe in May, but due to different reasons it was happening in October, and I think it was important that our presidents would discuss again where we are, what should we do, and if Turkey would join the circle of friends of Ukraine in this initiative which was announced at the United Nations, that will be extremely important.
All right, before we go on, let's listen to what the President said when summing up the results of the visit. Today, our delegations thoroughly discussed our cooperation in the trade, economy, and investment sectors. Over just 6 months of this year, the trade turnover between Ukraine and Turkey increased by almost 20%. The level of Turkish investments into the Ukrainian economy increased significantly as well. Turkey is now one of Ukraine's top 5 trade partners and top 10 foreign investors. The much-anticipated bilateral agreement on investment protection and the alterations we made to the double taxation agreement will give extra momentum to our bilateral communication.
I'm especially glad that we have signed the Mutual Alliance and Investment Protections Agreement and the Double Taxation Agreement. During our conversation, we have looked at the steps that we will take to develop our cooperation in transport, tourism, and the energy sector, in our military relations, defense industry, and culture. Apart from that, I would like to share some good news with our audience. In order to satisfy Ukraine's great interest in the Turkish language and culture, we are opening a Turkish cultural center named for Yunus Emre. With God's help, time will show that the Ukrainian and Turkish nations have grown even closer.
So Poroshenko and Erdogan signed several important agreements, and probably the most important are an investment protection agreement and the double taxation avoidance agreement. Ambassador Korsunsky, what is the significance of these documents in your view?
Actually, if we, to say strictly to the facts, those both agreements, they have been signed in the 90s and they were existing until recently, but 2 years ago it was decided on both sides that they have to be seriously updated because of changes in both Ukrainian and Turkish legislation, and to make them more useful instrument for development of our cooperation. And I'm very glad that it was done. I already left Turkey a year ago, so it was without me, but definitely it was a very important step. And the next one should be free trade.
And the Deputy Minister of Economy of Turkey has said that this agreement might be signed in 2017. So how likely is it to happen?
The problem is that basically this agreement already maybe 75–80% negotiated and agreed upon. But the problem is that there are some sensitive issues in this agreement, which on issues concerned the opening of the markets in Ukraine for Turkish goods and in Turkey for Ukrainian goods. And unfortunately, we are not able to come at this point to the final resolution of those issues, but they have been discussed. What is important to understand in our relations with Turkey, we have no problem on political level. So that means that political will is there. It's up to the professionals, to industries, to talk between them and to agree upon the schedule, how we can open our market for industrial goods for Turkey, and Turkey would open its agricultural market for Ukrainian products. Because for us, right now, agriculture is probably #1 priority, taking into account the export potential of Ukraine.
Why so much effort, Ambassador? Why ties with Turkey are so important to Ukraine?
We have to, I'll tell you, this is maybe not so widely known fact, that among all our trade partners, Turkey and Ukraine has a huge positive trade balance. Say, if we have 6 billion trade, 2 billion plus, it's on the Ukrainian side. And this is extremely important for our economy because the whole balance, trade balance of Ukraine, normally, as a rule, for 25 years is negative, generally negative. The most part of it is oil and gas. We were exporting oil and gas from abroad, specifically from Russia, and that it was distorting the balance. But with Turkey, we were always on positive side. So for us, Turkey was always the second destination of our export. Generally, in best years, we have had 8 billion trade. It's huge by Ukrainian standards. So right now, then it was decreasing because of war in Syria, because of occupation of Donbas, and because of annexation of Crimea. But right now it is improving, and this is very good. That means we are now started to get out of this crisis, both internally in Ukraine and bilaterally with Turkey. And for us, it's but agriculture now, rather than steel products as it was before, now agriculture is more important, and for Turkey this is very sensitive. And that's the similar position Turkey attached to every other free trade agreements with other countries. But now with Ukraine, we already negotiating very thoroughly for 2 or 3 years those issues. Hopefully they will be resolved soon.
You have already briefly touched upon the essence of my next question, but we know that Turkey maintains rather good relations with Russia as of now. And what sort of tension does it create in Ukrainian-Turkish relations, if any?
Definitely, that's a point of, I would not say concern, but very thoroughly watch on our side, the Turkish relations with Russia. I would like to stress that for Turkey, the principle of pragmatism in foreign relations is extremely important. From a pragmatic point of view, Turkey is exporting 27 billion cubic meters of gas. It's more than 50% of Turkey's consumption. Number of Russian tourists per year exceeds 4 million. And this is probably, normally it was #1, 2, they were with Germany. So it's huge money. We are talking about tens of billions of dollars of income to Turkey. A huge number of projects for billions and billions in construction area were conducted by Turkish companies. Russians are not able to build stadiums for World Cup next year. This job was in hands of Turkish companies. And then when the famous accident happened with Su-24, and Russia kicked out all Turkish business out of the country, it was visible that the loss on economical side is huge. So therefore, for Turkey, this is #1. It's extremely important. They have to cooperate. But #2, the issue which is emerged with Syrian conflict, that Turkey realizes now, more than ever before, that without Russia, unfortunately for us, definitely, we would be welcome if it would be Turkish-American alliance or Turkish-European alliance, and NATO would be probably more active in this conflict. But what happened, it just happened, that Russia and Iran and Turkey, they found the ground how to cope with this Islamic State. The most important issue in Syrian conflict right now, it's not Assad, it's Islamic State. This is terrible terrorism. It's absolutely unbelievable what they are doing in their territories. So to clean up Syria from Islamic State, it's in the interest of Russia, Turkey and United States and ours as well. So therefore, taking into account this political issue, Turkey had to cooperate with Russia. So I would not overestimate level of deep love in between Turkey and Russia, I would say. They have their serious problems still on economic side. And definitely the issue of Crimean Tatars on the radars, because for Turks it is absolutely principal issue that Crimean Tatars, they call them Crimean Turks. So this is a keen nation for Turks.
Yeah, and actually they call them their brothers.
Brothers, yeah. And
at the same time, while not recognizing the annexation of Crimea by Russia, they do not support sanctions against Russia.
Yes, and we, as you may imagine, we have been discussing this issue many, many times on different levels. Principal position of Turkey is that they do not trust sanctions. They do not believe in sanctions. They believe that you have to fight in court. You have to fight in international organizations level. That's what we are doing. But sanctions, they believe it's not workable framework. And by the way, when we talk about this right now, we can see that on one hand, we have a very thorough regime of sanctions from Western world. But at the same time, just one visit of King Salman from Saudi Arabia brought $10 billion of common fund, joint fund with Russia. So investment will be coming from the Persian Gulf, from China, from Eastern world. So that from Turkish point of view, this is another justification. So why we would implement sanctions regime if anyhow it will not work? We see the world differently. We believe sanctions are extremely important. We believe that Russia would like to maintain very good relations with the West. It's an important destination of their goods, their cooperation, and Russian oligarchs are hiding money in the West. So definitely sanctions must be in place. But Turkish position, it's like principle. It's not because of Ukraine, Russia, but generally speaking, they say we will not support any kind of sanctions regime in the world.
Coming back to Crimean Tatars, do you think that the actual help that they get from Turkey is as effective as Mr. Erdogan claims?
I think that they value very much Turkish position. Because I know for sure that at every meeting of Turkish officials with Russian officials, they raise this issue. They talk about Crimean Tatars. They bring this issue on the table in different international organizations. The other thing, whether Russians are listening to those requests, definitely, you know, Turkey is going through their own internal complicated political problems, specifically after this last year attempt of the coup d'etat. So what we see right now, of course, we would like to see more active position of Turkey. Of course, we would like to see more persistent push of those issues together with us on different levels. But again, the foreign policy, it's an art of possibilities. We cannot use this if and somehow we want to achieve the results. And with Turkey, I think what has been achieved during the recent visit, that was probably maximum we can get right now. And definitely we have to reciprocate. We have to work with Turkey on the issues in their interests. And that's exactly the art of foreign relations with other countries, how you build this balance.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Korsunsky, and we'll be back in a moment. If you believe the authorities, they betrayed the Ukrainian state. But if you believe their lawyers, they were just doing their job. Ukraine has pressed charges against 3 men accused of doing media work for Russia and its proxies in Ukraine's occupied Donbas region. 2 of the men were found guilty of terrorism charges and sentenced to 9 years in prison. The other is still awaiting trial. Since 2014, 173 people have been charged with terrorism in Ukraine. Let's have a look at the result of these criminal cases. As we see, 26 of those accused found themselves in prison. However, 125 were freed on probation. 8 accused persons were sentenced to restriction of freedom outside prison, and 2 got suspended sentences. In 7 cases, criminal sentences were overturned, and just 5 of 173 were found not guilty, and I'm being told that this was not at once. However, let's get back to the journalists or alleged journalists case. The Ukrainian Security Service accused Yevhen Timonin and Dmitro Vasilets, who were subsequently found guilty, of traveling to the Donbas in 2014 to help separatist news agency Novorossiya.tv set up its site and YouTube channel. But the men's lawyer, Olena Lyshenko, says they had no idea that the site would become Novorossiya TV. She also says that the accusations against them are mostly based upon a post in the Kontakte social network and publications by an activist group called Mirotvorets. Not enough for the terrorism charge.
It so happened that they were asked to set up this YouTube channel. They went to Donetsk. This was summer 2014. Not many people knew what was going on there. They went there with the aim of finding out what was going on. They went there by train, met with people there. They tried to sort out some kind of server, and that didn't really work out for them. They corresponded back and forth about that they had to stop, that it wasn't working for them. They were there for 4 days and went back. There were no questions from the Ukrainian Security Service. After that, they carried on with their journalistic and civic work for another 9 months. Only after 9 months were they put on the pre-trial investigation register. The body of evidence includes their online communication and screenshots from Timonin's Kontakte page, printouts of correspondence and conversations. First of all, there's nothing there. I've also read it. It's normal IT correspondence. They even mocked the channel somewhere in there. They spoke with various people. Someone called Mihailo invited them to Donetsk. He said that he represented the client. It wasn't clear how this man was connected to Novorossiya TV. There is nothing in the case files on whether he was connected, whether he worked there. That is not clear. He wasn't even questioned. It's like he's some mystery person. No one knows anything. They went there at Mikhailo's request. They arrived and went to sort out this server. All those from Novorossiya, the DPR, they were there, and that means they are guilty. The verdict is solely based on the Mirotvorets website, the Kontakte correspondence, the screenshots from the website. Nothing that would suggest they are guilty. 9 years is a harsh sentence. This case has changed jurisdictions 3 times. It's been transferred from one court to another. It's not at all clear why the case is being heard in a court in Zhytomyr. They both live in Kyiv. Why the case is being heard in Zhytomyr is a mystery to a lot of people. Now we are preparing an appeal, which needs to be submitted to the Zhytomyr Court of Appeal before October 28. We'll see what happens next.
Hromadske had also spoken with a lawyer of Vasyl Muravitsky, a journalist from Ukraine's Zhytomyr region, who was arrested in August. Muravitsky stands accused of state treason. The Security Service alleges he wrote custom articles against Ukraine commissioned by people in Russia. But Muravitsky's lawyer, Andriy Gozhy, believes that the case was opened because his client criticized the Ukrainian government. He says Muravitsky signed a contract to write columns on Ukrainian affairs for a Russian media outlet, and that writing articles cannot be considered state sabotage. What's more, Muravitsky does not recognize all the articles the authorities claim he wrote. Most worryingly, Gozhy says, the authorities have carried out a linguistic analysis of Muravitsky's articles.
If this person were not in pretrial detention and he wasn't facing 15 years in prison, I think we would laugh about this linguistic analysis, because it sounds like this. They take a phrase from the article credited to Morawiecki and remove it from its context. For example, he writes, quote, "The Shatun operation to destabilize Ukraine is likely a fake because the contents of this Russian Shatun operation appear to be written by a person who is likely Ukrainian-speaking, stupid, and so on," end quote. The expert then says this can be considered manipulating the public consciousness and insulting the dignity of the Ukrainian state. There is no proof that he committed treason because according to the law of Ukraine, you have the right to express your opinion. You can even lie. And if a person is lying, you can't take him to criminal court for that. You can take him to civil court. What is state treason? It is sabotage. And what is sabotage? There should be a concrete violation of the law. For example, helping a foreign intelligence service, stockpiling weapons, harboring saboteurs, cutting cables. That's sabotage. But writing articles, working as a journalist, only our security services could see it that way.
The Committee to Protect Journalists has described Ukrainian law enforcement's actions against the press as politically motivated, particularly in relation to Vasyl Morawiecki. The non-governmental organization sent a letter signed by its executive director, Joel Simon, to President Petro Poroshenko.
We feel compelled to write to express our deep concern about actions taken by Ukraine's State Security Service that pose a significant threat to press freedom in Ukraine. In at least 7 separate incidents documented by the CPJ in the past 2 months, the SBU has targeted newsrooms and journalists on accusations that appear politically motivated and in retaliation for critical reporting.
Morawiecki's trial is still ongoing. Timonin and Vasilets, found guilty for aiding Novorossiya TV, are currently appealing their conviction. If that fails, they plan to take their case to the European Court of Human Rights. Will Hurd has an unusual background for a U.S. congressman. He spent 9 years working for the Central Intelligence Agency, with a focus on counter-terrorism in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. Today he represents Texas' 23rd Congressional District, which is located along the border with Mexico. During a visit to Kyiv, Hurd sat down with Hromadske to discuss lethal military aid to Ukraine, Russia's U.S. election hacking, and his views on U.S. politics.
One of the reasons I'm here, this is my second time to Ukraine, because I think what is happening in eastern Ukraine is terrible. It is not a separatist movement. It is Russian invasion of a sovereign country. And for me, what they're doing when it comes to electronic warfare, we should be doing more working with Ukraine. The U.S. and the Ukraine should be doing more to counter the electronic warfare of the Russians. Now, what you can expect from Congress is there's only 2 countries that Congress has passed independent appropriations, that's funds to another country, Israel and Ukraine. In our appropriations, we've allowed up to $50 million for lethal aid. And that is something that I know this administration, the Trump administration, is reviewing the provision of aid. Because I believe things like javelins are needed here to help with Ukrainian defense against Russian aggression.
What is the probability that it happened? Because the talks are there on the air for a while. Now there is a kind of new movement from Pentagon.
So I think when the Trump administration came in, they had a number of issues to review across the world. And, Secretary Mattis, the head of the Department of Defense, has been out here understanding these issues. Our National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, has been out here. So I think the timeline for a decision on the lethal aid question is soon. I wish I had a more specific number to be able to give you, but I think when you look at what the Trump administration has done when it comes to foreign policy, a little bit more aggressive foreign policy, and folks like H.R. McMaster and Mattis have made it clear that Russia is one of our #1 threats.
You mentioned cyber warfare, and in particular, you used to work for intelligence, for CIA, and when we look to all these reports, you know, it's still, we kind of lacking some evidence, and there are always a question that how we can't really prove the Russian involvement to kind of nail it down. Why it's like that? Why there is a failure not really to put the evidence? Otherwise, there are always, you know, it seems like there are more rumors than the hardcore evidence.
So when it comes to cyber attacks, the issue of attribution, being able to attribute the attack to someone. Now, being able to attribute that to the one hacker, you know, that was sitting at the computer is really hard. But being able to attribute it to the Russian SVR or the Russian GRU is actually not that difficult, because usually the infrastructure that is used in attack, we're aware of who created that infrastructure. And so when it looks to being able to name a specific kernel in the Russian SVR, that may be difficult, but knowing that it was the Russians, I think it's been very clear on all of these major attacks. And so that's something that we have to continue to press. And one of the problems that we have is, what is a digital act of war? That's not a settled question. And if you look to the UN and they say, if you manipulate somebody's electric grid, that's an act of war. Well, that happened here in Ukraine by the Russians doing a cyber attack on the utility grid. And there was no response from the international community, which to me is unacceptable. We should be establishing what our responses should be to certain types of behavior, right? We should be able to say, you should have certain red lines that say, if this happens, here's going to be the response. And the response may not be a digital response. Two summers ago, when the Russians were involved in trying to influence the U.S. elections, I had been saying from the very beginning, at a minimum, we should kick the Russian ambassador out of the country. So our response to behavior doesn't always have to be in that same realm, but we should be thinking through what those issues are. For me, right now, the sanctions against Russia for their invasion of Ukraine, I think that has to stay until Ukraine is whole again.
President Trump recently again was speaking about building the wall with Mexico. You were speaking really much against that. And you're a Republican. How it goes together, and as well, what is the probability of building this wall?
So I have 1,300 kilometers of border between the U.S. and Mexico, more border than any other member of Congress. And building a wall from sea to shining sea is the most expensive and least effective way to do border security. We should be thinking about a smart wall where we can use manpower and technology to determine what is or isn't coming across our border. It's a fraction of the cost of building a concrete structure, and it's more likely to happen. This debate is going to continue through December, and we'll see how it ends up.
Do you have support in your party, and how divided is the party? I mean, you're Republican, speaking against some of the policies of the president.
This is the great thing about the United States government, is that even though I'm of the same party as the president, I agree when I agree and I disagree when I disagree. Nobody has ever said, no, we shouldn't be using technology to defend our border. And I think when you start seeing working prototypes of the type of technology that can be used, I think that's going to ultimately change a lot of people's minds.
You worked a lot on counterterrorism in the Middle East, in Pakistan and there. Now we're speaking about the time when there is a chances to defeat ISIS. But everybody says, especially when we talk to the people on the ground, that there is no strategy what to do next, because there could be some terrorist attacks in other towns if the caliphate is destroyed. So your experience, what really should be done to deal with this issue, with the post-ISIS caliphate?
Look, we've defeated a number of terrorist organizations before, but the ideology still exists. I think when we look at terrorism, we got to think of it like influenza. We've never been able to get rid of influenza, but it comes up in certain areas worse than others. We have to make sure there's political stability in these regions where you see the Islamic extremism grow, but we also have to do a better job of countering Islamic extremism as well. ISIS's ability and their previous ability to push their message and hit hundreds of thousands of people in all over the world, we have to be ready to defend against that kind of ideology. And that's something that governments and the private sector have to continue to work together in order to make sure that that message doesn't sink into the minds of young men.
On the 11th of October, LGBT activists in the city of Kharkiv successfully held a rally in honor of the World Coming Out Day. But the event got off to a rough start. It was nearly cancelled after someone called in a bomb threat to a nearby museum. However, after security forces searched the area, the rally was allowed to continue, protected by 250 police officers and National Guard forces. However, it wasn't all good news for the LGBT community. This week, Belarusian LGBT activist Edward Terlecki was denied political asylum in Ukraine. In 2009, Terlecki fled to Kyiv from his native Belarus. At home, he had faced persecution for organizing LGBT pride parades in Minsk. The Belarusian authorities had forcibly sent him to a psychiatric hospital where he was diagnosed as schizophrenic because he worked as a drag performer. After arriving in Kyiv, Terlecki immediately applied for political asylum in Ukraine. He said he feared imprisonment and potential sexual abuse in custody at home. Last month, over 7 years after he arrived in Ukraine, the State Migration Service declined Terlecki's asylum request. Because he continued working as a drag performer in Kyiv, Terlecki had clearly come to Kyiv for professional reasons, the service concluded. Terlecki filed an appeal in court. Just this week, a Kyiv court upheld the Migration Service's decision. To discuss the Terlecki case and LGBT rights in Ukraine, we're joined in the studio by Ruslana Panukhnik, Executive Director of Kyiv Pride. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
What do you know about this case, Terlecki's case?
Actually, basically, the information that you've already said, I guess that this case is one among numerous cases that our migration service is denied. And I'm not talking about only LGBT grounds when the people are denied their asylum or refugee status. As far as I know, the whole acceptance rate in Ukraine is very low, like 4 to 7% from all the cases filed to the migration service. So I would not say that this case is politically motivated or etc. I guess that is among the others in the usual practice of the migration service.
Can we talk about authorities being specifically unsympathetic to LGBT people, or rather LGBT asylum cases? Do LGBT people face discrimination in the Ukrainian legal system as a whole?
I would say yes, because the Ukrainian legal system generally do not recognize LGBT as the ground for the discrimination. So LGBT people are not protected by law because our authorities, our judicial system, our executive system, like law enforcement system, decides on whether LGBT grounds are enough to realize that the people were discriminated or not. So they decided on their own. So we don't have any practice or any law stated that these issues are protected.
Let's come back to the Kharkiv rally. You were there. Do you have anything to add to what I said?
Yeah, of course. So I've been to Kharkiv because Kyiv Pride is very supportive to the regional organizations and initiatives, especially to share our experience and to make whatever possible from our side to connect regional activists to the police or authorities in the regions. So I was the part of the negotiations with Kharkiv police in this case, and I'm very happy that this event went successfully, peacefully, and everything went well.
Was it harder to talk to Kharkiv police than to the police in Kyiv? After all, in Kyiv there were several rather successful pride parades, but in Kharkiv, as far as I know, there's no such experience.
Yeah, in Kharkiv this was the second public event, but the first one on the May 17th this year were not so successful, this one. And yes, it's like if we compare communication and negotiation with police in Kyiv now or in Kyiv in 2013 when we started to organize pride parades and etc. So the difference is huge. So I would say that police in Kharkiv is more cooperative and more willing to communicate than police in Kyiv back in 2013.
Oh, I see. Yeah. All right, but how does it reflect the general attitudes in the society? Do you think that after LGBT events, public events have become, well, if not common, then more common, the public attitude changes? Do people become supportive or sympathetic or at least non-aggressive towards LGBT open manifestations?
Of course, because as you already said, this public event was dedicated to the International Coming Out Day, and it was intended to raise visibility of LGBT people in Ukraine or in this particular case in Kharkiv. And according to the national surveys conducted recently, just at the beginning of this year, only 5% of Ukrainians know somebody who is LGBT. So only 5% of people know someone who is in their near surroundings. So visibility is a key that to people to understand and to accept LGBT people. So I guess such kind of events, public events, is the beginning of big and a great path to the acceptance and tolerance in Ukrainian society.
Thank you, Ruslana Panukhnik, Executive Director of Kyiv Pride, for being with us on Hromadske International.
Okay.
It is one of the most famous phrases ever uttered about the USSR. There is no sex in the Soviet Union. But that wasn't true, says American filmmaker Chad Gracia, who is turning his lens on the Soviet Union's biggest social taboo. Sex existed, Gracia says, but sex education didn't. And the Soviet regime used sex as a tool of its espionage, both at home and abroad. If anything, the Soviet society suffered not from a lack of intimacy, but from the inability to talk about it openly. Chad Gracia sat down with Hromadske to discuss.
How would you describe the Soviet Union as a country in terms that they treated sex? What kind of country it was?
I think there were three main ways of, three main spheres of sex. There was the official sphere, and during Stalin times and not long after, there was the official description of what sex should be. And we know exactly, it should be 2 minutes, once per week, and no longer. And it should be between a man and a woman in marriage. Full stop. This was the official sex. Then we have the sort of sex of the ordinary people. And I would say that probably it resembles sex anywhere else in the world. We're animals, and many people had normal sex lives, maybe not a lot of sexual education, but still they had no complaints, people we've talked to.
Okay.
And then there's the third category, and that's the category that I would call Soviet sex. That's the category where the strictures of totalitarianism entered into people's lives. And that is where all of the pain and lies and evil manifested itself. And that was seen everywhere, from prohibitions against homosexuality, against abortions, lots of different problems in different decades, depending on where you were and at what time you were living in. People were afraid. People were afraid that if they did something wrong in their career, they would be accused of a sexual crime that they didn't even commit by a neighbor who wanted their apartment. On the other hand, people were able to commit sexual crimes as long as they were a powerful member of the party. They could rape young girls, and it happened very often, even here in small towns in Ukraine. And that's what I think of as the evil, the dark side of Soviet sex. And really, it's what happens under totalitarianism, when there's no free press, when there's no free courts. When someone is raped, there's nowhere to turn.
Okay, you just said that there was no sexual education, and why do you think it was such a taboo in the Soviet times? Why sex was such a taboo? Why was it such a repressed subject, repressed topic?
I think that there's a relationship between how free a society is and how freely it speaks about sex. And the less free the society, the more, of course, the more control that the government wants to have over every individual. And in a totalitarian society, the deepest form of control, this is the subject of Orwell, is the bedroom and even your unconscious thoughts and your desires. And so in the Soviet Union, sex was so highly controlled that people were afraid to even speak about it, because maybe they might say something wrong, or maybe their words could be used against them, or maybe we know that teachers weren't allowed to speak about sexual education. The hero of our film tried to get schools in Vinica and across Ukraine to teach about sexual education, because he was seeing already 14, 15-year-old girls and boys with sexual diseases. And he was seeing young girls who were pregnant and coming and saying, "But I didn't kiss him while we were in bed."
I don't understand why I get pregnant. Yeah.
Exactly. So he, Dr. Mikhail Stern, he saw the suffering that this closed society created, and he tried to open it up. He failed, of course, and ended up in jail. But for me, and for the people working on our film, he's a hero, because he was trying to fight against a totalitarian system that made sex a taboo, and instead to speak about it closer to how we speak about it today.
Okay, you just mentioned it. You just said about this people who, after the revolution, they said that we want to have the sexual freedom. So, and I know that you researched the Soviet Union, how the treatment of sex changed during the times. So can you tell about that? How did it change, actually?
Yeah, this was something that I didn't know about, and that was that the revolution was not only a revolution in politics and in economics, it was a sexual revolution as well. And there were it was a crazy time. There were parades down with virginity. Virginity was considered to be a bourgeois concept. And so in schools, 17, 18-year-old kids were organized to march against virginity. In one small town, in several small towns, there was an idea that all boys and girls should register. And if they don't have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, they can choose from a list, have sex, just like drinking a glass of water, as Alexandra Kalantai put it. So there's been a long history throughout time of people going into this extreme sexual openness. And so in Russia, it took the form of women and boys, but mostly women, were pressured into having sex, because if they said no, it was a sign that they didn't support the ideals of communism.
Okay.
They weren't sharing themselves. And that was used against mostly women. And within a few years, this kind of phase died out. Now, in 1933, all of this openness towards sexuality was completely closed by Stalin. And
why do you think it happened?
I think Stalin wanted order. Stalin wanted to control the citizens in every way. He also realized that in order to build a big army and lots of workers, you need marriage and no birth control and no abortion and lots of babies. And so I think he did everything that he could to create those circumstances. But I also think that he had a sick fear of the non-traditional, which...
Was there a kind of sexual revolution in the Soviet Union? You know?
Well, certainly there's the Stalinist era, which is tied up with the war era, which was tied up with sexual atrocities committed, again, mostly against women, both by German troops, Russian troops. This was a decade plus of sexual horror, which I think left a wound on the Soviet mind, the Soviet psyche, up until the late 50s or early 60s. I think that by the 60s, after Stalin had died, and there was the beginnings of some thaw, there was a little bit more openness. And I discovered that starting from the 60s, there was a serious, large-scale program to find young boys and girls, swallows and ravens, they were called, and recruit them into the KGB, train them in how... First, they had to train them in sex. So, ironically, one of the few places in the Soviet Union
where can you learn something about sex was KGB.
Yes. So in school, they didn't teach you about sex. But if the KGB thought you could be a good sex spy, the first thing they did, they brought 100 students into a class. And we know this from several memoirs of one in particular of a woman who was able to escape. And she's in our film, in one of our reconstructions. They took 100, 200 students and they showed them pornography. And most of them were totally freaked out, but that's how they introduced them to sex. And they talked about sex openly. Again, probably nowhere else in the Soviet Union were people talking about this as openly. And then they actually had these students watch people have sex, and then they themselves had to have sex with either other students or visiting army cadets. And they would, according to the memoir of our hero, the army cadets, these young boys, 17, 18, 19, their job was to say no. Girls had to seduce them. And there were up to 10,000 sex spies working in Moscow, Petersburg, across Eastern Europe, and in places like London, Paris, throughout the world. And they were extremely successful. In fact, there was a special branch of sex spy. It was a 40, 50-year-old man who focused on the secretaries of important NATO strategists, generals, colonels in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe. And these male spies would find the secretaries, who mostly were either widowed or didn't have husbands. They pretended to fall in love with them. Many cases, they actually married them for many years and asked them to start to bring home materials from their boss. And when the Cold War ended and the wall fell and the archives were opened, they realized that the Soviet Union knew everything that NATO was doing, everything that NATO was planning, and almost half of the secretaries, the older ones without husbands, were sleeping with or married to or having affairs with Russian or Soviet male sex spies. So until this day, the programs continue.
Thank you from the entire team of Hromadske International. We're here to explain Ukraine and Eastern Europe for you. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook, and goodbye.